Joining us, Professor of Law at Hofstra University, James Sample, former United States District Judge in the Southern District of New York, Judge Shira Shenlin, host of the Bulwark podcast, and MS Now political analyst Tim Miller, and Semaphore Congressional Bureau Chief Burgess Everett. Tim, can you tell that that soundbite from the speaker, that it looks on its face to be fraudulent, I don't know, got stuck in my craw today?
Well, you're channeling my rage, so you're doing my job for me in the commentary seat. But look, I just would add a few things to be specific about it. Number one, the thing that he described there that looks fraudulent, and we can be honest, he knows better. He knows it's not fraudulent. This is a lie that the Speaker of House is perpetrating on the country because it gives them, he perceives, potential political advantage in the future. But what he described is the thing that looks fraudulent is otherwise known as counting votes. Yeah, and this just like happens in anything in life. Sometimes you're watching a sports game and some team's leading and then the other team makes more baskets after that, then they win. Like the fact that there were 3 occasions where there was a Republican who led in the first tranche of ballots and then another tranche came in and they were behind. That's normal. That could happen because it came in from a more blue part of the district. It could happen because the Republicans, Mike Johnson himself, have been just railing against mail-in voting, and so only Democrats do mail-in voting now. So there are tons of logical reasons for this. It's just important to say. I think the thing that he said to me that is the most alarming, though, about what's to come is specifically pointing out California. And I think that there is legitimate critique of California's ballot counting. In a first world country, it shouldn't take a month to count the votes. But the problem is, I think now Mike Johnson is already signaling that they're going to use their illegitimate arguments to try to create trouble between Election Day and when the ballots are actually counted in California, and they might use the perception or their lies about fraud to prevent new Democrats, let's say, from being seated. And I think that's a real potential threat as we look ahead to about this time next year.
Burgess, how widespread is commentary like that among Republicans in Congress?
I mean, it comes, it goes, it ebbs and flows a little bit. I remember after the 2020 election and when Trump began contesting it and trying to overturn it eventually, there were a bunch of Republicans who ended up disagreeing with that attempt, who were kind of saying, well, we should look into this, we should look into fraud. It's possible that the president actually won. And I remember that pretty vividly because these were people that ended up disagreeing with the president on this front. So I think what we're hearing from the speaker right there is probably a little bit of an attempt to get in Trump's good graces and harmonize with him. I'm not really aware of any negotiations going on Capitol Hill with regards to a bipartisan elections law. So I'm not exactly sure what he's referring to there. There is a Republican bill called the SAVE Act that is being talked about, that is voter ID. And we can get more into that if you want to, but that seems to be the proposal that's kind of out there right now.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a moment. But let's talk about the harmonizing, as you just mentioned, Burgess. And James, on the harmonizing with the president on elections being fraudulent or not being fair because suddenly Republicans start losing as ballots are counted, which is, again, how Tim explains how elections work. When you harmonize with the president on that, what you do is you create the circumstances for a vast number of Americans to decide that the election is not fair because they didn't win and they're angry about it. And then you have the conditions for what happened on January 6th.
Yeah, no.
Didn't they learn that lesson?
Well, you're absolutely right. Whether they learned the lesson or not, that's hard to say. But to Tim's point about counting, absolutely, and Mike Johnson knows that. Mike Johnson's comment there is a piece in a larger puzzle. And it's an indication that these words are also combined with action, right? President Trump may talk about things that sound crazy, but he always has somebody willing to take some action. He may talk about trying to take over Greenland, but there's at least an attempt. And yes, he was rebuffed. But if you think about Mike Johnson's comment, it is a brick in the wall, just like Steve Bannon saying we're going to have ICE at the polling places, just like Tulsi Gabbard going down to Georgia. Just like all of these things that get the threats against election officials, the rhetoric about voter fraud that doesn't exist. When you talk about nationalizing elections, especially nationalizing them on a partisan basis, we need Republicans to take over 15 states. You're not actually trying to promote election integrity. You are affirmatively seeking to undermine election integrity as a predicate to do things that are also unconstitutional.
Yeah, and they're being pretty open about it. Let's listen. You mentioned Steve Bannon. Let's listen to him.
You're damn right. We're going to have ICE surround the polls come November. We're not going to sit here and allow you to steal the country again. And you can whine and cry and throw your toys out of the pram all you want, but we will never again allow an election to be stolen.
The election wasn't stolen. When you're talking about people who were not supposed to vote in elections, the idea that there's fraud, the number is minuscule. Minuscule. In Georgia, I think it was 8 people total that weren't citizens who voted fraudulently, but 8 people in Fulton County in the ballots that they just seized. But this messaging is pervasive, and it is preying upon people who want to be convinced that they're being sidelined, that the government is corrupt.
Well, but there's a really important point to make. It's about deterring and depressing the vote. Yeah. If you instill fear in the voters, if they think they're going to go to the polls and find armed masked agents, they just might not go to the polls.
Armed masked agents, by the way, who just killed 2 American citizens.
I understand that. So if you say, should I vote today or not? Maybe I'd better not go. I think it's a campaign to deter and depress the vote, because otherwise they don't think they're going to win the next 2 elections. And this is a reaction to the fear of not winning. And things got worse today. The Supreme Court is letting the California map go forward.
Why is that worse?
Because there's 5 seats now in California that can go through. So I'm just saying worse in the sense Republicans are more worried that they won't win the midterms or the presidential.
So when Donald Trump talks about federalizing election, he can't federalize an election. That's Congress's purview. The elections are up to the states. He can't do a lot of the things that he's arguing, executive order to end mail-in ballot, but he's putting it out there. What can he do, James, other than surrounding ICE around ballot boxes and intimidating at the polls? What can the president do to disrupt?
Well, Article 1, Section 4 gives the power to the states, but it does give Congress a backup role. So the question in terms of what he can do, it really goes to Burgess's answer with regard to the SAVE Act, or the new SAVE Act 2.0, which is not just voter ID. It also has...
Should we get Burgess to explain it to us before we go into this?
Sure.
Sorry for interrupting. Burgess, explain the SAVE Act.
Well, as he was referring to, they're working on an updated version of it, but the general gist here is to require proof of citizenship before you can vote. And a lot of Republicans were trying to attach it to this government funding bill just a few days ago and they were basically backed down by the president and said that the Senate had made a commitment to either use its rules or change its rules to be able to pass it by a simple majority. We're finding out in the aftermath of that that's not the case. The Senate Republicans don't have a plan to do that, and they're not going to change the rules. So this bill doesn't really face any sort of path to law. And I'm also reminded 4 years ago, Democrats were very concerned with some of the changes that states were making, like Georgia, to their own election laws. So they had a national response to that failed in the Senate, and they tried to change the rules for that as well. And Republicans all opposed that. So it's interesting how it only took 4 years for the shoe to end up totally on the other foot.
Good point, James.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think wherever one stands on the filibuster, it is times like this where party control is consolidated entirely across Senate, House, and the White House, where the filibuster does really have some real teeth and some real value, because concentrated control and the ability to write the rules of the game is a dangerous combination, which is why we have a decentralized system. The irony in terms of what Burgess is referencing, and he's absolutely right there about the juxtaposition of left and right with respect to state control versus federal control, is the one area where Congress is given greater authority in elections is with respect to instances in which states have a history of racial discrimination, the Voting Rights Act. Well, what is the Supreme Court engaged in basically the final hours of striking down and putting the nail in the coffin? The one area where federal control, and yes, that's pushed by the left, anti-discrimination practices that are a part and parcel of the Voting Rights Act, one of the most successful pieces of legislation ever. That's on the chopping block, but the Republicans want to have voter purges, proof of citizenship, and mail-in balloting. That's the difference. It's not just a juxtaposition. You have to dig down into the merits of what they're trying to accomplish.
So, Judge, part of what stopped 2020 from getting overturned was Donald Trump brought a number of cases in front of judges, and I think all but one of them were thrown out. But we've seen, and we just covered this a moment ago, in Minnesota, where a judge was exasperated, and so was the federal prosecutor, the line prosecutor. The judge is saying, why is the administration not complying with these court orders? And she said, I don't know. I keep trying to get them to do so. Please put me in contempt and throw me in jail for a night so I can get some sleep. This is a federal prosecutor saying this. So what happens if the administration, if there are cases brought and the administration just doesn't follow the court orders?
So we've been asking that for months now. What is the remedy if these court orders aren't followed? And the only thing we can come up with, and I say we because judges have been talking about this, is contempt of court. And that can be a criminal contempt or a civil contempt. Are you going to start throwing federal prosecutors into jail? Obviously not. Why? Because they're resigning. They're resigning by the tens and dozens, maybe hundreds by now, because they don't want to carry out these orders, and they don't want to lie to courts, and they don't want to disobey courts.
But you have to go up the chain then, and then what happens? Are you in a constitutional crisis where one branch of government is trying to imprison another branch of government?
That's exactly what a contempt would be. If a federal prosecutor disobeyed a court order, the only remedy that really makes sense is contempt. That's right. And who's going to prosecute that contempt? Because usually it's the executive branch. So now you need a special person outside to do that prosecution.